President Cyril Ramaphosa's enactment on 23 July 2024 of 3 new pieces of legislation poses grave threats to the economic environment. Once implementation by the multi-party government starts, the Public Procurement Act, the National Small Enterprise Amendment Act, and the Climate Change Act will increase the cost of doing business in South Africa while accelerating state failure. Each is potentially harmful enough on its own, but they all add to an ominous series of legislative threats along with the recently signed NHI Act, the Employment Equity Regulations, and third wave BEE directives. Businesses would do well to anticipate the effects of the attempted implementation on their operations, as well as on the implications for the stability of the multi-party government. Below, we provide a brief outline of their salient features. First, the Public Procurement Act. The Public Procurement Act is a recipe for accelerated state failure. It seeks to compel all state entities to pay exorbitant premiums for procurement based on a tendering party's race, nationality, and other criteria, instead of prioritizing value for money for the public. And it also wants to centralize procurement policy under national government. The new act will drive up procurement costs and degrade service delivery and state administration. Its complex array of preferential procurement prescriptions includes set-asides, pre-disqualification, subcontracting conditions, and local content requirements, and these will all greatly diminish the pool of available suppliers, leading to what, as it always does, to spiraling costs and lower quality. The complexity also forms the ideal cloak under which to conduct self-interested, corrupt, and politically connected procurement, instead of procurement in the public interest. The scope for wasteful expenditure under this Act is enormous. The Act is intended to replace the Preferential Procurement Policy Framework Act, the old PPPFA, which had its drawbacks, but nevertheless limited the extent to which central government could prescribe non-value-adding preferential procurement. In part of this new Act also represents an attempt at countering Sakaliga's Constitutional Court judgment on procurement in 2022, in which we protected the choice of municipalities and other state entities to determine their own value-for-money procurement policies. The Act purports to achieve what the minister was then not lawfully able to achieve through regulations, and that is precisely why it remains unconstitutional. Neither Parliament nor a minister is empowered to bind an organ of state to specific preferential procurement policies. Section 217 of the Constitution assigns this discretion to organs of state themselves, and even then, it is subject always to getting value for money. Sakaliga will now scrutinize this Act to determine appropriate steps in countering it and retaining possibilities for normal value-for-money procurement with taxpayer funds. The second Act is the National Small Enterprise Amendment Act. This Act purports to support small businesses, but instead poses a considerable threat to them and to business in general, all too familiar. It seeks to subject all private contracts between businesses, where one of the parties is a small business, to government review, and this is in violation of long-held principles of contract law and freedom to trade. The key feature is the establishment of an ombud service for small enterprises, and this ombud service will have substantial powers to investigate complaints and arbitrarily defined unfair trading practices. It will be able to refer matters to the minister, who will then be able to declare what the solution should be and impose administrative penalties. The Ombud will be added to a burgeoning web of agencies connected to the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. We already know how that stifles commerce. The new Act proposes giving the minister far-reaching powers to interfere in contracts and dealings with small businesses. That's the bottom line. Now, the effect of the Act, if it is diligently implemented, would be to make dealing with small businesses much more costly and less attractive for medium and large businesses, yes, but also for other small businesses. And this will harm the growth prospects for small and large businesses alike. The third act is the Climate Change Act. This convoluted act envisages a mountain of new state planning, monitoring, and reporting bureaucracies. Its key enforcement mechanism is emissions limits per business to be determined at sector and subsector industry level even, with wide discretion for the minister to regulate production, impose penalties, and more. Now, these emissions limits themselves are to be determined by an opaque and complex mix of international commitments, imprecise emissions estimates and forecasts, and a host of political and socio-economic considerations. Anybody's guess what the answer will be. Businesses in affected sectors would be allocated a limit called a carbon budget and would be required to submit and stick to a greenhouse gas mitigation plan. Much of the Act's practical impact depends on specific emissions limits, sectoral coverage enforcement stringency, and voluntary compliance levels. So businesses are at risk of being saddled with high reporting costs and significant growth constraints. Restrictions and higher costs on, for example, coal energy risk keeping the country in a severe energy deficit that constrains economic growth and employment. And even something like livestock farming could come into the crosshairs of emissions limits. As with all quota systems, at some point, there will develop a shortage of available carbon budgets for a sector. And if you're in this sector, that's going to be a problem. Follow through to their conclusion, these sector emissions limits will then leave no room for allocating additional carbon budgets to new business entrants, potentially having the perverse result of capping new business formation and entrenching established firms at whatever their production levels were before. The complexity of the entire framework also lends itself to corruption, distorted incentives, and considerable bureaucratic costs. We will have more to say about the Climate Change Act in forthcoming analysis. For now, we caution that the Act's approach trades substantial and direct economic and social harms for uncertain and highly contested benefits. Hindering economic development adds to tangible environmental risks such as deforestation and water pollution, and social risks like crime and political unrest, all of which are pertinent in South Africa. We regard the blunt, centralized economic planning envisaged by the Act as unfit to address an issue of such high scientific complexity with such widely divergent subjective risk and risk management appraisals, and with a plethora of intricate and weighty social trade-offs. In conclusion, we must resist a centrally planned economy. These three acts and other recent policy threats are stark reminders that the state's goal remains to have a say over every aspect of the economy and to control all economic activity either directly or through regulatory intervention. This is a tried and tested recipe for stagnation, de-development, and social decay. And these legislative trends also underscore the likelihood of persistent state failure in some very key areas. We are reviewing options for resisting several recent legislative threats. SACLIGA remains committed to developing comprehensive public interest litigation. This utilizes the judicial branch of the state as best as possible to enable reform, and at the same time to build alternatives to failing state, municipal, security, and diplomatic structures where necessary. We will also continue to encourage maximum achievable non-compliance with harmful regulations in the interest, ultimately, of flourishing businesses and the communities they serve.